Welcome back to AI.Code.Cast. Today, we're diving into a fascinating problem that kind of blends binary strings with a bit of a mountain climbing challenge.
Sounds fun.
You ready to tackle special binary string?
Absolutely, yeah. These strings have some really intriguing properties that make them pretty unique.
So let's break it down for our listeners. What exactly makes a binary string special?
Well, a special binary string has two key characteristics. Firstly, it has an equal number of zeros and ones.
Okay.
Think of it as perfectly balanced. But here's where it gets interesting. Every prefix of the string must have at least as many ones as zeros.
Okay, I'm picturing this like a mountain range. Each one represents an upward climb,
Okay.
and each zero is a downward slope.
Right.
The rule is that we can never dip below our starting elevation.
That's a great analogy. It definitely helps to visualize the constraint.
Yeah.
So we have these balanced strings that resemble mountain ranges, always rising or staying level.
And the challenge is,
The challenge is to rearrange a given special binary string to create the lexicographically largest one possible.
Right.
Imagine you're like reshaping those mountain peaks to create the most impressive skyline.
lexicographically larger. For those who maybe haven't encountered that term before, could you give a quick example?
Of course. Imagine you have two strings, 101 and 011. Even though they both have the same digits, 101 is considered lexicographically larger because it has a 1 in the first position, while 011 starts with a 0.
Right.
It's like comparing words in a dictionary. We look at the characters one by one from left to right to determine the order.
Got it.
Yeah.
So in our mountain range analogy, we're aiming for the highest peak to be as far left as possible.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, how do we go about actually solving this problem?
There are several approaches, but let's start with the most straightforward one, brute force.
Okay.
It's not always the most elegant, but it can be a good starting point to understand the problem space.
Brute force, the try everything approach. I can already sense some potential pitfalls here, but walk me through it.
So in this context, brute force would involve systematically generating all possible swaps of consecutive special substrings within the given string.
Hold on.
Yeah.
By special substrings, you mean sections of the string that themselves follow the rules of a special binary string.
Yeah.
Those little mountain ranges within the larger range.
Exactly. So we'd take our string and consider all possible ways to swap those mini mountain ranges.
Yeah.
For each swap, we'd check if the resulting string is still a valid special binary string.
Okay.
If it is, we compare it to our current best string and keep the lexicographically larger one.
Okay, I see the logic, but wouldn't this get computationally expensive really quickly? The number of possible swaps seems like it would explode as the string gets longer.
You're absolutely right. That's the major drawback of brute force. Its time complexity, or the amount of time it takes to run, increases rapidly with the size of the input string.
So brute force might work for small strings, but for a massive string, it's like trying to climb Mount Everest one step at a time.
Right.
Not very efficient.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We need something a bit more strategic, a way to break down this problem and make it more manageable.
So if brute force is our starting point, what's the next step up on this algorithmic ladder? Is there a way to leverage the structure of these special strings to our advantage?
There is. In fact, there are a couple of more sophisticated approaches.
Okay.
One leverages the power of recursion, while the other cleverly utilizes a stack data structure.
Interesting.
Both take advantage of the inherent properties of special binary strings to arrive at a solution more efficiently.
This is getting really exciting. We've laid the groundwork with brute force, but now it sounds like we're about to explore some truly elegant solutions. I can't wait to delve into recursion and stacks in part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned, listeners. The best is yet to come. Welcome back to AI.Code.Cast. We left off discussing the brute force approach to maximizing special binary strings, and you're right.
It can get computationally very expensive.
It can, yeah.
It's like trying to find the best route through a maze by checking every single path
Yeah,
possible, but definitely not the smartest way to go.
for sure.
So what's a more efficient alternative? You mentioned recursion. How does that play into this?
So remember our mountain range analogy?
Yeah.
Recursion really shines when we can break down a problem into smaller, self-similar subproblems.
Okay, so we're thinking about those mini mountain ranges within the larger string.
Exactly. Any special binary string can be seen as like a series of these mountain substrings.
Right.
With recursion, we can focus on maximizing each of these smaller mountains individually and then combine them strategically.
I'm intrigued, but I'm also a bit wary of recursion.
Okay.
I know it can be elegant, but it can also lead to those like confusing nested function calls.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through how it would work for this problem,
Yeah,
step by step?
absolutely.
Maybe with a simple example, string.
Of course. Let's say we have the string a 1 1010.
The goal is to rearrange this to get the lexicographically largest special binary string possible.
Okay.
With recursion, we'd start by identifying those individual mountain substrings.
Okay, so in this case, we'd have 1100 as one mountain
Yes,
and 10 as another.
precisely. They each
Yeah.
have an equal number of zeros and ones, and never dip below their starting point. Now, the recursive magic happens.
Okay.
We essentially apply the same logic to each of these substrings.
Okay.
So for 1100, we'd again look for smaller mountain units within it.
But 1100 seems like it's already a single mountain.
Yeah.
We can't really break it down further, can we?
You've hit upon a key concept in recursion, the base case.
Okay.
When we encounter a substring that's already a single indivisible mountain, we know we've reached the bottom of our recursive calls for that branch.
So for 1100, we'd just return it as is.
Exactly. Now for 10, it's already a single mountain as well.
Right.
So at this point, we've recursively broken down our original string into its fundamental mountain units. 1110.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
We've divided and conquered, but how do we put these pieces back together to get our final maximized string?
This is where we need to remember our goal to create the lexicographically largest string possible.
Right.
Essentially, we want to arrange these mountains so that the highest peaks are as far left as possible.
So we need to sort these mountain substrings.
Yeah.
But how do we decide which one comes first? They both start with 1.
This is where we go beyond just the first digit.
Okay.
Since both 1100 and 10 start with 1, we look at the next digit.
Yep.
1100 has another 1, while 10 has a 0.
Right.
Since 1 is larger than 0, 1100 comes before 10.
Ah, so it's like a tiebreaker.
Exactly.
If the first digits are the same, we move on to the next one until we find a difference.
Right.
Clever. So our final string would be 11,010, which in this case happens to be the same as the original string.
Exactly. Of course, in other cases, the rearranging might be more significant. The key is that recursion provides an elegant way to break down the problem, solve it for smaller pieces, and then reassemble those pieces strategically.
I see the beauty of recursion now,
Yeah.
but I'm still a bit apprehensive about its efficiency.
Okay.
Didn't we say earlier that it can also run into time complexity issues similar to brute force?
You're right to be cautious.
Okay.
While recursion is smarter than brute force, it can still lead to a lot of function calls, especially if we have many nested mountains within mountains.
Yeah.
There's a possibility of those calls adding up and making things slow.
So recursion is more like a skilled climber who knows the best handholds, but might still take a while to scale a really complex mountain.
A good analogy.
Is there a way to optimize this even further? You mentioned a stack-based approach earlier.
Yes.
How does that compare?
A stack-based approach offers a different perspective on the problem.
Okay.
It's like having a more organized and systematic way to identify and manage those mountain substrings without the overhead of recursive function calls.
Okay, I'm really curious now. How does a stack help us with this problem? It sounds like we're shifting from climbing gear to logistics management.
That's a great way to put it. Imagine the stack as a holding area for the ones we encounter in the string.
Okay.
As we go through the string, we push these ones onto the stack.
So the stack helps us keep track of those upward climbs in our mountain range.
Precisely. And when we encounter a 0, it signifies a downward slope.
Okay.
Now we need to check if this 0 balances out a 1 that's already on the stack.
Ah, I'm starting to see the logic. We're using the stack to ensure that we're always maintaining that balance of upward and downward movements, just like in a special binary string.
Exactly. We only pop a 1 off the stack when a 0 comes along to balance it out.
Right.
This way, we effectively identify those mountain substrings as we go through the string.
This sounds incredibly efficient. But how do we actually use the stack to construct our final maximized string? Do we sort the elements in the stack?
It's not quite as straightforward as sorting the stack directly. We need to use the information stored in the stack, the ones and their positions, to strategically build up our final string piece by piece.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into the details of that process, but I think we're nearing the summit of part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned, listeners, because in part 3, we'll unravel the intricacies of the stack approach and compare all 3 solutions head-to-head. Welcome back to AI.Code.Cast. It's the final ascent of our deep dive into maximizing special binary strings. We've explored brute force, admired the elegance of recursion, and gotten a glimpse of the stack's power.
And now it's time to compare these approaches head to head.
Okay.
We've hinted at their strengths and weaknesses, but let's really analyze their
Sounds
performance.
good. Throughout this deep dive, we've talked about how some approaches are more efficient than others.
Right.
But how do we actually measure that?
That's where the concept of time complexity comes in.
Okay.
It essentially tells us how the runtime of an algorithm scales with the size of the input.
Okay.
Imagine processing a string with 1,000 characters versus 1,000,000. How much longer would each approach take?
Okay, let's start with brute force.
Okay.
I have a feeling it won't fare too well in this comparison.
You're right to be skeptical. Remember how brute force checks every possible swap of special substrings? As the string grows, the number of these combinations explodes exponentially.
Yeah.
We're talking about a time complexity of O of n to the fourth in the worst case, where n is the length of the string.
So if we double the length of the string, the runtime could increase by a factor of 16. That's not ideal.
Right.
Brute force is definitely the tortoise in this race.
It is, but it's still a valuable tool for understanding the problem and for very small strings, where simplicity trumps speed.
Right.
Now, how about recursion?
Okay.
It's definitely smarter than brute force,
Okay.
but does it escape the time complexity trap?
I'm remembering all those nested function calls.
Right.
It felt a bit like going down a rabbit hole,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder about its efficiency.
You've hit the nail on the head. Those nested calls can add up, especially if our string has many layers of those mountain substrings.
Right.
In many cases, we're looking at a time complexity at around O of n squared log n for recursion.
Okay, so recursion is faster than brute force,
Yes.
but it's still not winning any speed awards.
Yeah.
It's more like a gazelle, quick, but maybe not built for marathons.
A good analogy. So that leaves us with the stack approach.
Right.
Remember how it systematically identified and managed those mountain substrings?
Yeah, it felt a lot more organized and controlled, like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly. By avoiding the overhead of recursive calls and cleverly using the stack, we can significantly improve the efficiency.
Oh.
In most cases, the stack approach achieves a time complexity of O of n log n, which is primarily due to the sorting step.
That's a cheetah. So for large strings where speed is paramount, the stack is the clear winner.
It often is. But before we crown the stack champion,
No.
there's another factor to consider: space complexity.
Ah, right.
So considering not just how fast a climber is, but also how much gear they're carrying.
Right.
Does one approach stand out as particularly heavy or lightweight?
Well, brute force, with its straightforward approach, tends to have a relatively low space complexity.
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't need any complex data structures.
Yeah.
So its memory usage is generally proportional to the input string.
So brute force is traveling light even if it's slow.
Yeah.
What about recursion? All those nested calls, do they gobble up memory?
They can.
Okay.
Each function call adds to the call stack, which takes up memory.
Right.
In the worst case, recursion for this problem could have a space complexity of O of n.
Okay, so recursion packs a bit more for the journey.
Yeah.
And what about the stack approach? Does using a stack itself add to the memory burden?
It can. The stack can grow quite large, especially if there are many nested mountain substrings.
Yeah.
This means its space complexity can also reach O of n in the worst case. So both recursion and the stack approach are like well-equipped climbers, carrying more gear, but capable of tackling tougher challenges.
And great way to put it. Choosing the right approach depends on your priorities: speed versus memory usage, simplicity versus sophistication.
This has been an incredible journey. We've gone from the basics of special binary strings to dissecting 3 distinct algorithms.
Yeah.
We've compared their efficiency, considered their memory usage, and learned when to favor one over the other.
And I think we've left our listeners with a final intriguing question. Could we combine aspects of these approaches?
Oh, interesting.
Could a hybrid solution leverage the best of each world?
That's a fantastic challenge for our listeners to ponder.
Yeah.
We've equipped you with the knowledge. Now it's time for you to explore and innovate.
Keep those coding brains buzzing.
And join us next time on AI.Code.Cast for another deep dive into the fascinating world of algorithms.